Hi, Robert. Welcome to Twice Told.
Oh, thank you, Braven.
The pleasure is all mine. So, before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to the concept behind Twice Told. So, Twice Told is an endeavor where author and reader sit across from each other and discuss the book in detail. Hopefully, we uncover insights that went into this book, perhaps some topics that you wanted to write about but could not for editorial reasons or otherwise.
Hmm.
And both of us hopefully walk back a little wiser. I know for sure I will learn a lot more than what I've known so far by reading this book. I hope this conversation also sparks some moments of insight for you. Fingers crossed for that. So, the idea is the book comes told, or the book is told, is when it hits print. Up until then, you had a version of the book in your mind.
Yes.
There was another book which you probably had when you started writing it. Perhaps a couple of versions would have developed along the way. Then your editor said, no, this is not going to work. This is how you should do it. That comes edition four. And finally, whatever number edition was this that got told, which hit print. And then I read this book with some biases, some information, maybe some misinformation as well. And then I formed these questions, which we'll come to in a short bit. And then now I'd like to clarify those questions. And that's when this book truly comes back alive for me. That you, as the author, you're clarifying my questions and doubts and enriching this reading experience for me. And the book then comes alive as Twice Told because I have read it, you have written it now, but we both are discussing this again. It comes to life in a different way than it had been otherwise as a author and as a reader.
Hmm. All right then.
Thank you, Robert. So my first question is going to be about why did you write this book and what epochs or episodes in history does this book cover that you believe were not sufficiently addressed before?
Okay, so my specialty is early American history and in particular the Trans-Appalachian frontier. So I look at a lot of um, you know, colonists and Americans dealing with native peoples and the sort of give and take that involved. Um, it's funny you mentioned the sort of earlier versions of the book. The actual case that led me to sort of pursue this, for several years, actually ended up getting edited out of the version. They wanted that was an editorial decision. They like books to be shorter now, and in fairness, perhaps nobody wanted to read a 400-page book about murder. Um, but it could get a little depressing. But yeah, so that actually the case that sparked this one. Um, actually ended up in an article I wrote for the American Indian Quarterly some time ago. But it was what was fascinating about that one was you had in a time of peace, um, a couple Cherokees were out hunting and they got murdered by and robbed by some white men and local officials, including one of the guys who was the founding one of the founding fathers of Tennessee, decided, you know, we know pretty much who these guys are, and there's no way a local jury is ever going to convict them of this crime. And so he suggested, why don't we just tell the Cherokees where these guys are and sort of let nature take its course, which just floored me. Right? You don't hear that very often, right? That's certainly not the standard narrative. But unfortunately, that one ended up getting it. But that led me to delve really deeply into this question of how do these different groups handle intercultural murders in particular, and what sort of challenges does that face? What does that bring for them, and how do they sort of try as much as possible to keep the peace, or at least seek advantage in these rather unfortunate situations?
It's a fantastic subject that you've written about, and I would have, for one, loved to read a 400 page book on this subject. In fact,
I
the
will
bigger
note that to my editor.
please, if you can possibly get an unabridged or revised edition, which is 400 pages thick, you know you have a reader for sure.
Well, as soon as I get my own press, we'll make that happen. That's,
Fingers crossed for that. Now, this is a very interesting topic that you write about. Now, word murder is or homicide.
hmm.
We usually think about it in interpersonal circumstances, that these are acts of passion, acts of pre, perhaps premeditated, but with some motives behind it. But now that we're talking about a clash of cultures, not just between two cultures, but several different cultures. Now, how did Native American tribes deal with murder as a socio-political construct prior to Columbian eras? Do we know something about this? Do we have material evidence about how did these tribes judge each other on murder and not necessarily war?
So, you can do a bit of what an anthropologist would call upstreaming, which is you look at basically from the earliest contact, how do Native peoples handle, those types of conflicts, and then you can kind of extrapolate sort of back to, well, they probably, it's sensible to think that they would have looked at it this way and this way. In general, murders as opposed to sort of broader scale warfare. I mean, the professor answer, I'm sorry, is, well, it depends on the tribe and the era and so forth. But um, as a general rule, um, north of the Ohio River, those peoples tended to be at least uh, open to the idea of settling the question nonviolently. What the historian Richard White wrote a lot about this, called covering the dead. Basically, someone in my family killed someone in your family, but we sincerely apologize and we make restitution. Right? We give you some gifts and maybe a string of white wampum to show our grief, and we're very sorry. And a lot of times that is how people's preferred to handle that north of the Ohio River. Although the Iroquois League, what's going to become upstate New York, is they would do that sometimes, but they also had what they called mourning, MOURN, war. Whereas if someone in their sort of clan units would die, not even necessarily being murdered, just could have been an accident. To assuage that grief, the elder women in the clan matrons, would insist that a war party go out and basically take a life from someone to sort of restore that balance. But generally in the North, there's at least the possibility of cutting, some type of peaceful deal. Generally speaking, at least for the historic period and probably before, a lot of Southern tribes, particularly the Cherokees, who actually culturally are actually pretty similar to the Iroquois, and the Muskogees or Creeks, especially tended to follow what came to be called the law of blood, and which is sort of a fascinating thing. Basically, the idea, if someone in my clan group gets murdered, his spirit is essentially going to kind of haunt me until we have sort of, kind of struck back. And again, it's this idea, philosophically, it's the idea of restoring order to the universe and sort of balance. But in practice, it's blood revenge. And that's going to be actually when colonial officials and then later the United States start having to deal more and more with those folks. They really, really try to get them to abandon this idea of the law of blood. But almost certainly before Columbus, this is how they would handle it. If a Cherokee man got murdered by a Chickasaw, well, then a Cherokee war party is going to go after them. And now, of course, the problem is that tends to be cyclical, right? And you get in this chicken and egg thing. It's like, well, who started it? Well, this is I suppose, though, for a lot of Native peoples, given that is how, the sort of warrior culture for young men, this is how one of the ways that young men can prove their worth is through courage and skill in warfare. I mean, there's certainly a cultural function to this. One of the downsides is, again, it's kind of, you don't have like these sort of massive wars necessarily like you'd see on the plains of Europe, but it's also kind of unceasing in a way, which, and those casualties do add up.
Understood. So, how do we make sense of murder in intertribal conflicts during war and outside of war? So, what might be deemed an acceptable level of losses? We know in Napoleonic European
Right.
wars, 25,000, 30,000, these were, you could just brush it off as, sure, regular casualties. But if this unfolds on the American plains, as
Mm.
well as south of the Ohio River, this would have devastating consequences to tribal politics and the population in general. So how did these tribes then mediate such conflicts? How did they come at what is an acceptable number of losses in terms of men slain?
So, I mean, I'm not sure I can throw you a stat, but yes, the difference is, and when you read, Europeans seem to be sort of really almost dismissive of native warfare. It's like, oh, well, it's just a few raids back and forth, and you only had two people killed or something. What's the big deal? But again, Europeans aren't fighting major wars every single year, year after year after year, and I'm not the one who figured this out, but for a lot of native peoples, again, basically every summer is sort of fighting season. Well, again, because there's no real let up to that, losing two or three men of fighting age out of a village, or having two or three women captured or killed, that really adds up, and so they become. Certainly by European standards, very casualty averse. But again, it actually makes a lot of sense because if these things add up. If you are losing people every single summer, you can't afford to have a major setback. And of course, for a lot of young Native men, if they wanted to be a war captain, right, to sort of lead war parties, well, if you developed a reputation for losing men on raids, pretty soon no one was going to follow you, and you couldn't sort of make them, and so you're going to lose status in that because again, they tended, yes, they would like for you know if you've got Shawnees are raiding into a Cherokee village, right? Sort of traditional combatants, and you'd like for your party to come back with a few scalps and so forth. But more important was, do you come back with all of your men intact? That's the big thing. That's more likely to get people to follow you because again, they simply can't, you know, makes they can't sustain those types of casualties year after year after year. It just they don't have the population base.
Understood. That being said, but do we know of any wars of extermination fought between tribes within the American continent?
So, pre-Columbian is very difficult to say, right? I mean, although there was clearly warfare going on, they've archaeologists have found, cemeteries from like say the 13th, 14th century where you had mass numbers of people interned, all with head injuries. Well, I mean that's probably not a picnic gone bad, but after that, in terms of extermination, that's the tricky part because you do have major campaigns post contact. For example, famously the Iroquois League, right, the Haudenosaunee of upstate New York, engaged in a series of external attacks on their neighbors and then on Ohio Valley Indians in the 17th century. But and while they are possibly trying to sort of eliminate those other peoples as kind of political entities. The tricky part is calling it extermination because they have a different goal. In many cases, the primary goal was not actually to sort of wipe people out as it was to sort of capture people who would be good candidates for adoption and bring them into the fold. And so the Iroquois, again, in the 17th century, they're making a deliberate play to try and grow the size of their league. What they didn't count on is that all these military campaigns basically sort of ramped up infectious diseases, and so it kind of ends up being a bit of a wash in terms of total numbers. In terms of, but the goal when they attack the Huron, who are eventually going to become the Wendots, or the Eries, or some of these other groups, they're not actually trying to sort of slaughter everybody. They would like, particularly women and children, they would like to adopt them into the tribe and build it up. But again, this does lead to some tribes kind of ceasing to function as political entities.
Understood. One thing I looked forward to reading in the book was the definition of what is a tribe. Is it a
Hmm.
hermetically sealed unit? So that's one. And then methods of methods or modes of sustenance, hunting versus farming, what was the balance, and how did tribes arrive at the perfect number of young, strong fighting men that they knew that they're ready to go for on campaign season, that they have enough surplus labor that they don't need to divert toward farming or hunting or just ensuring that you have homes to build. So you have these men who can be sent off to campaign. Otherwise, you would end up with starving family back home and men off to war, and that's not going to work out right.
Certainly not long term. Okay, so tribe versus saying nation, it tends to be depends who you ask. One thing we still do, and I do it. Most scholars, we will talk about like I was a Shawnee village or a Cherokee village, but and certainly by the 18th century, so many of these places actually had people from all kinds of different tribes that are married in, and so you might say it's a Shawnee village, but they're actually some Mingos who were actually an Ohio Valley offshoot of the Iroquois, for example, living amongst them because a woman or a man had married somebody and they sort of moved in. So yeah, in some respects, talking about sort of tribal identities, I mean, they're mostly about language and culture, but even then that gets tricky. My favorite example with students is, and part of this is, by the way, Europeans and later Americans like the idea of, though we're dealing with a nation that has and that can sort of enforce its own laws and stuff, and then which is just really not how it plays in these sort of decentralized societies. But one of my favorite examples, the Muskogees, right? The Creeks. You have sort of the upper Creeks and the lower Creeks, and of course outsiders refer to them as the Creeks, but their languages were so different. Frequently, when they would try and sort of have like sort of a big intertribal council, they would have to have interpreters for their own. So imagine if we had to have that in the Congress, for example, the congressman from Georgia could not be understood by the congressman from Maine and vice versa unless they had a translator there. So in terms of that, it's a little dicey. In terms of sustenance, when you're east of the Mississippi, or the eastern woodlands, got the beverage here. One of the advantages I suppose men would have for warfare is that the vast majority of calories people are eating are actually produced by Native American women. Unlike Europeans, for natives east of the Mississippi River, farming is actually considered women's work. Farming and then sort of gathering of stuff, whereas hunting and fishing, those are sort of male occupations, and those are important, but most of the food is actually coming from corn, beans, and squash that the women have raised. So that when you go on a war party is actually pretty important because yes, if they lose a couple hunters in this war party, that's not great, but it's actually not impacting the vast majority of the calories. At the same time, though, because women were so important and people understood this for the economy and for the sustenance of their people, they actually had quite a bit of influence on politics, either directly or indirectly. And again, one of my favorite examples of this was so you have women, let's say a number of men in the village get angry and they want to sort of go out and attack another group. But the women, because they have sort of this insular community, for example, have a good idea. Well, how many women are pregnant in the village at this time? And if it seems too many, we can't afford to lose husbands. They could effectively veto a war party. That is, they can't. Most native peoples, especially in this area, don't do coercive authority. And if the men say, again, the Shawnees want to go raid a Cherokee village, well, we can't stop you. We can't force you. But the women were the ones who controlled the corn, right? And of course, you need it's called no cake. It was basically dried out corn, then pounded into a powder. It's like a quick and easy trail ration that when you're moving fast on the run, you need to sort of have this rather than stopping to hunt or whatever. The women controlled that. They're also the ones who made moccasins. And of course, if you the war party wants to go and the women don't agree with it, well, that's fine, but you're going to be hungry and you're going to have blisters on your feet within a day or two because we're not giving you any spares moccasins, we're not giving you any corn. So good luck with that. And so that they could actually impact things that way. But in terms of logistics, yes, this was a typical European frustration. Again, overall, basically, you'll see time and again, um, Europeans and later Americans, they essentially want natives to sort of adapt to the way that they prefer doing it. And so, um, while Europeans, it seemed perfectly rational to have a military campaign that might go on for months and months or maybe even years, for native peoples, those husbands, like, yeah, they could be spared for a few weeks at a time or maybe a couple months, but eventually their wives are going to want them back home shooting deer for meat and for hides and so forth. And so they can't. This is one of the things that actually helps break up Pontiac's war towards the end of 1763. And the war kind of lingers for a while, but basically those guys were not sort of socially, economically equipped to be away from their villages for months and months and months on end. That's just not how their societies worked. And so when eventually they just kind of get bored and go back home.
Interesting. One could almost draw parallels between this kind of warfare and the warfare that you saw between in 1917, 1918 Russia, the white counter-revolution to the Marxists, that the men would almost seemingly get bored, or that they had pressures back home that they had to tend to family or tend to crops, and then the movement seemingly breaks away. But that's an aside. Now, another question that since you've written such a fantastic topic, is the impact of matrilineal tribes, and how did that make an impact on war making decisions?
So that is something that really you could say, and there's been Theda Purdue, among others, has done really great work on this. Um, Europeans are sort of flummoxed when they notice how much, with a lot of people, again, the Cherokees are a very good example of how much direct political influence women in the tribe had. And they're not used to, which is weird, by the way, because right, the English had Queen Elizabeth for so long, but they don't like that. They want to sort of feel like they're dealing with men. And as we get into the 18th century, um, as these alliances get tighter, and it's also tied very much with the economics of the fur trade, as native peoples go from enjoying European trade goods, firearms, and so forth, to increasingly finding them a necessity of life. And also, and it's a tight loop because they have to have increasingly those guns and knives and so forth to effectively hunt to get deer skins or beaver pelts to then turn into more guns and gunpowder and so forth. As they get tied tighter in their alliances to Europeans tend to sort of insist that they follow their cycles and sort of their process about war. Again, the Cherokees or the Creeks would be a good example. Before this, warfare was very often actually initiated by sort of leading women in the tribe who felt that they had been wronged by a traditional enemy or something, or they needed to restore balance. And so they would actually call upon the young men in their clans to go out and make war. Well, certainly by first third or the mid 18th century, well, no, now the war making, who are we as Cherokees going to fight? Well, we're going to fight who the English are asking us to fight because they're really important trading partners. And so a lot of times they're, again, not traditional enemies or someone that necessarily the Cherokees would have had a beef with. It's just, but this is what the English want. And Purdue and others would point out when they start making this more sort of warfare based on European economic and political considerations, they're kind of effectively shoving women out of the equation more and more. Or more gruesomely, actually, a lot of times when war captives would be collectively tortured in a village, women were actually kind of the ones sort of in charge of that. And as Europeans increasingly saying, "Well, we really don't like you doing that. That's you should stop that." They're again sort of cutting women out of the loop on that and sort of forcing them into a less important role, which I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. But anyway, it's not my call. I just report.
Of course, that's what we do. We don't pass judgment. But we don't hold grudges and biases. We just observe and report the best way to go about
As
with it.
best we can. Yes.
Exactly. Now, speaking about intertribal conflicts and reparations, you mentioned white wampum. Now, was this a general practice amongst tribes now, given that even members of two different tribes in the same state, say the state of Georgia, if they required interpreters to communicate between them, was there some kind of common ground that could be achieved in terms of reparations or calling a truce?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry, I got you mentioned the wampum. Wampum was initially, it's interesting, sort of a cultural practice using these little shell beads up in the Northeast. But it actually, by the mid-18th century, it had become such an accustomed sort of part of native and European diplomacy that Southern tribes actually start using it as well. But sure, they had ways to sort of work out truces, and again, that's something most native groups had, we tend to sort of focus on the warfare because that's sort of sexy, but they also had very accomplished diplomats among them as well. And so, yes, they could. And there's actually a practice, for example, between the Cherokees and the Creeks, where they would actually have effectively diplomats, sort of long term, Creek men would stay in Cherokee villages and vice versa, who helped serve. And I think partly that's just sort of a recognition, those two of the larger, more imposing groups in the Southeast, that, maybe we shouldn't be constantly fighting each other because it's just kind of a drain. And so, yes, they had actually, in some cases, very sophisticated diplomatic protocols that they could use to sort of stop these. They don't always work, but sometimes.
Understood. No, do we know instances of intergenerational warfare because of some personal feud which escalated into a tribal conflict and now it's a matter of honor, that this cyclical version of revenge begets revenge continues to pass on for generations?
Well, I mean, there were certainly groups that had, by the time Europeans encountered them, had actually been fighting each other for a long time. Again, we talk about these sort of, traditional. That's always kind of a sticky word. Traditional enemies. Again, the Cherokees and the Iroquois League had fought each other for a long. And again, this is one. Even regardless of sort of European influence, they would sort of go after each other because, again, who started it? Who's to say? But this was a way for young men to sort of prove themselves. Cherokees leading a war party up and vice versa. One thing we note, sort of in the diplomatic correspondence, is by the mid 18th century, the Cherokees were sort of really feeling this. Partly because they'd actually gotten in some conflicts with the colony of South Carolina that actually hurt them quite a bit, and they actually start seeking aid from English officials like Sir William Johnson up in New York, to try and mediate with the Iroquois to sort of put an end to that long term. But yeah, some of these groups had fought each other. By the time colonists encountered them, these groups were fighting each other, as far as I could tell, because they'd been fighting each other for a couple hundred years or something. And that, and again, that's, yes, intergenerational conflict. If your grandfather was killed by the Senecas, you're probably not interested in what initially caused it. Just and so that can play into long-term conflicts.
So, how many tribes had this notion of justice? I ask because this is so reminiscent of, say, a Ghilzai tribe fighting the Popalzai in Afghanistan, or the Durranis having beef with some other tribe. And this goes back generations, apparently to some sense of slight that I was not given due honor or I was cheated. Then, this honor, the sense of being offended, features as a primal motive for seeking war or reparations via blood.
Well, yeah. Now, I'm not sure I can sort of list chapter and verse on that, but no, of course, a lot of these things, and it's, um, I guess, complex phenomena tend to have complex explanations, right? So it's, uh, a a Mohawk war party came into Seneca I'm sorry, into Cherokee country, and they killed a couple of people, but they also maybe kidnapped somebody's wife, or they stole some horses. So, well, there are multiple, there's a blood revenge thing, then there's, I would like to recover my kin. There's also, materially, I have been not just insulted, but also sort of wounded because the horse was valuable, and so all kinds of reasons. that I suppose that's a flaw in the human genome. We rarely have trouble figuring out reasons to want to harm each other. It's sort of much more difficult to sort of figure out why we should maybe not.
Tell me about it seriously. I mean, this is one trait which flows seamlessly from Americas through Asia and the rest of the world. I mean, we don't need reasons to fight. We'll invent reasons where they
Yeah,
don't exist.
yeah. Well, and again, I mean, it's the motives seem to be sort of markedly similar, and also the inability of many of us to recognize, like, yeah, you're really the net gain here is actually it's going to be a net loss. This is not good, but yeah, that's probably more a
Exactly.
philosophy question. Yeah.
Now, moving the conversation forward toward Native American and European conflicts, be it war, be it outside of war, how did these play out?
How did the wars play out?
How did these not just wars but also individual interactions which might have led to uh, fight, perhaps a dust up that led to a murder possibly? And how did these kind of conflicts, petty conflicts, not outright war, how did these play out between European settlers and Native American tribes?
So, I mean, a whole slew of different ways, right? Sometimes it might be an isolated incident. Sometimes, sort of, one angry word or gesture might actually bring on a whole war. I mean, it's, and there's also, the lack of trust between the different groups has an impact on that. Greg Dowd had a great book about the impact of rumor on the frontier. And I talk about, there are several of these sort of really kind of horrific murders of Native people by whites who later claimed, oh, well, they had heard that there was a war coming. Yeah, the ones I talk about seem to have been like those in Pennsylvania seem to have been kind of just a rather flimsy excuse. But um, these things could be settled. Increasingly, something I found the more I delved into this topic, especially as we get again sort of past the mid 18th century, seems to be kind of like an important period. Is they effectively start getting into this idea of I think I refer to as homicidal arithmetic at some point, where it's like, okay, well, you know, uh, five Indians were killed, but five settlers were killed in a separate incident. Well, maybe that sort of balances things out. They could do that, or you'll also find again some peoples increasingly want to I talk about for example again the Iroquois League in the years after the American Revolution. There were instances where um, white men actually murdered peaceable Iroquois men and seem at least to have been ready to sort of very severely punish them, perhaps even capitally. And yet the Iroquois basically, oh no, we'd rather prefer to handle this with sort of covering the dead, give us some gifts, an apology, which not only sort of from their perspective, well, at least we're getting something, right? We don't really gain a tremendous amount by having somebody hanged. But also, the really shrewd part of that is then they're kind of establishing a precedent that, well, if one of our guys gets mad and kills one of yours, we don't actually have to see them handed over for execution. Again, there are a lot of accounts of Native peoples, particularly this sort of Euro-American obsession with hanging people for murder. Native peoples tended to see that as just a really sort of beastly way to kill someone. I mean, they tomahawk you in the head, but that seemed okay. Hanging seemed kind of unnecessarily cruel. And then I also talk about there were in preparation for this, I think I counted up like six or seven total, a handful of cases where white men actually murdered peaceable Indians, were convicted, and then were actually capitally punished. Or at least, well, there are three guys in Massachusetts who were sentenced to capital punishment and then actually had their sentences commuted to life in prison. But there were a handful of cases where whites actually did get punished for killing Indians. But again, after the mid 18th century, it's a very, very imbalanced sort of ledger sheet. And that's probably one of the reasons why settlers become increasingly sort of violent towards native peoples. They feel they have an incentive, right, for either direct robbery, homicide, or for sort of land acquisition. And at the same time, they realize, again, these weren't necessarily a bunch of rocket scientists, but they understand the chances of them actually being punished, at least by white authorities, are just so small that, why not? Why not just start murdering people? Which is, again, sort of really unfortunate. The idea of sort of law and order out on the frontier, especially, is really, really weak during that era.
Understood. How does this, how does the arithmetic of trade between Indians and white settlers play out during this while, and how does homicide become a part of it? Since referring to the title of your book, Killing Over Land, how does murder start to feature as a bargaining chip? And when do you start to see its first expressions?
So, I mean, the idea of murdering native peoples being beneficial. Again, there's a very good argument to be made. The Virginia colony, within like a couple of years already, and certainly after the 1620s, that seems to be the pretty sort of manifest equation. The more native peoples we kill, the more land we can take. And of course, certainly by the 1620s, Virginia had gone from this idea of, oh, we're going to be a series of sort of isolated trading posts, the fur trade, and we're going to have nice relations with the Indians because that just makes business sense, to they really do sort of, they don't know the phrase settler colonialism, but that's what they're doing. Again, we want to profit off of the land itself as real estate ventures or through agriculture, and natives are the obstacle to that. So that plays out. Virginia from the beginning. Again, I talk about in the book. Pennsylvania is kind of weird, right? Because it's founded by an actual practicing Quaker who really doesn't want to see anybody get murdered, and yet. And so in the first few decades, right, they have probably as good a relations with native peoples as you can in terms of justice and sort of trying to sort of get along. And then again, particularly by the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, they go completely opposite. And, again, Pennsylvania, probably, yeah, the two most infamous massacres of native people in the 18th century are both committed by Pennsylvanians in the 1760s and the early 1780s. So, yeah, they take a really sort of hard shift. But again, it just tends to. I think the critical mass is in when the colony or later the state, people sort of come to the conclusion that it's well, possibly fun, but certainly profitable to kill native peoples because you're not going to get punished, and there is a lot to be sort of gained from it.
Understood. Now, settler colonials may have motives as their own, while the settler state has completely different motives, and their motives would often be at odds with each other. That is, the settler colonials wanted more land regardless of the natives, and the settler state wanted to preserve relations with those tribes so that they don't have outright war. I mean, we're here to do business and not be fighting wars and diverting toward expenses. So, how did these politics play out between the state and the settler?
Well, I wouldn't. The ultimate goal is the same. The difference is rich, influential men would prefer to do this, through treaties rather than through gunfire. But whereas sort of, poorer folks out on the frontier, they don't really have the option to pursue diplomacy, even if they wanted to. So they're taking more direct means. But there's this sort of that was also something I found surprised me maybe a bit. Again, if you read the correspondence of, say, colonial officials, or then later in the American period, federal officials, they really don't like frontier whites for the most part, right? They consider them sort of, drunken, bloodthirsty troublemakers and so forth. And keep in mind, though, part of that is because they are sort of mucking up the situation. Officials would like to buy the land quickly and cheaply without bloodshed. And where these guys are sort of starting fights with native peoples, that is sort of slowing down the pace of real estate development, if you just to put it like that. Again, very few people want to move into an active war zone for some reason. And also, they tend to, in many cases, Pennsylvania is a good example again. They're squatting on lands that either the colony governor or later the state is claiming for itself, and so they're causing a problem there. At the same time, the paradox is if you and they again you read the correspondence, they hate these guys, and yet if you look at sort of the net effect over time, uh, say the Scots Irish, for example, take a lot of sort of blame for this, but if they start a fight with the Shawnees or the Delawares out on the frontier, this is problematic in the short term, right? People are getting killed and you have to put expenses, but eventually what's going to happen is natives are going to lose that conflict, and when they sue for peace, the equation is they're going to have to cede even more land to the government authorities. So um, I don't know if, again, frontier settlers necessarily saw themselves as sort of the shock troops who are facilitating settler colonialism, but that is kind of how they directly or not functioned. And again, the sort of the general pace is, and I talk about this as well. Uh, Officials almost never hand land back to native peoples, and that's part of the equation. It's always they're always going to be acquiring more, and that sort of the seesaw sort of tilts rather heavily in their favor.
Understood. Now, when white officials acquire land, do they have condition that the natives should not be found on on this property?
So it depends on the treaty. Um, and this actually does lead to troubles. For example, there are going to be some treaties that the U.S. government signs in the 1790s, like the Treaty of Greenville, where yes, natives have agreed, signing, making their mark on this document. Well, you're ceding this land, but that also grants them open-ended rights to hunt on the land, which again, and apparently a lot of native peoples assumed, oh well, they mistook this for, well, this is kind of like the French and the British and the French, the British, and the Spanish before us. They're claiming this land, but we can go ahead and keep using it, and so that's fine. And as more and more settlers move in, of course, they sort of disrupt the hunting capabilities of that land. That is going to bring additional friction. So, sorry, did I answer the question? Is it? So
You did,
okay, okay.
yes. And now tell us about shaming, the European concept of shaming individual perpetrators, especially whipping and caning in public. And of course, you mentioned hanging, and you also write in the book that the Native Americans looked rather disparagingly toward it, calling that process barbaric. How did Native Americans process the concept of shame, especially if a warrior is flogged in public?
So I don't think it's so much a like one culture recognizes shame and the other doesn't. The difference is native groups, just painting with a broad brush, tended not to go for corporal punishment, which was, of course, widely accepted in the European context. And the basic idea being, well, if a gentleman transgresses, you can fine them. But if a ditch digger does something wrong, well, he doesn't have any money, but we can take it off his back, right? We can whip him, and the idea is that's supposed to sort of discourage that kind of behavior. A criminologist could probably argue maybe it doesn't, but that was the idea. For native peoples, this idea of sort of say flogging someone, uh, whether the transgressor was a native or non-native, that just seemed weird to them. First of all, they found it a bit objectionable, but also, again, let's say I'm a Delaware man and this white guy robbed me. Well, seeing him flogged publicly or thrown in prison was being punished, but how's that helping me really? And, I would rather, you made him pledge to sort of recompense me with pelts or trade goods or something, rather than sort of being tossed in prison like that. um, and then of course there's also an added dimension. So native peoples have sort of trouble understanding why you would do this in the first place. And then you get an added dimension as slavery becomes more and more important in particular in the southern colonies. Native peoples would have been sort of, I think, clued into the fact that increasingly, whipping someone publicly, that is for an inferior person, right? That is, and so in cases where Native men were flogged, it's not only, I'm very literally insult added to the injury, right? And so they really don't care for that. That causes a lot of friction.
Understood. Did native tribes and white settlers develop any codes for transgressions around alcohol? If a drunk person were to start a fight or kill somebody, was this adjudicated differently as opposed to premeditated homicide?
So Peter Mann calls the expert on this, but just cribbing from him. So that again causes trouble because the two groups have sort of differing ideas about alcohol. For a lot of Native peoples, they didn't actually necessarily see drunkenness in and of itself as a problem. It's like, well, no, I was drinking to get drunk. That's why I wasn't sort of sipping. It's not a sipping whiskey to me. The idea was, especially in the early days, oh, this is essentially like a quasi-religious experience. I'm sort of doing this, and one thing that, particularly when it comes to violence between groups, up to and including murder, is for a lot of Native peoples, you weren't necessarily liable. It's kind of, today we say, well, that was the alcohol talking, right? It was, or I wasn't in my right mind. Um, they didn't feel that they should actually be held to account for something that they'd done when they were drunk, right? Well, I wasn't in my right mind. And there also seemed to have been at least a number of cases where Native men were sort of really angry with someone and would deliberately get drunk because they didn't want to be held responsible for beating the crap out of somebody. Which again, white authorities tend not to sort of buy that doesn't work so much in European jurisprudence. You're still responsible. And that is going to there are a number of instances, a couple I write about in the book, where that sort of differing viewpoint, again, natives can't understand why they're being punished for something. Oh, well, but I was drunk. Why would you hold that against me? Um, yeah, and again, you increasingly see, especially as we get into the 19th century, whites sort of looking at alcohol as sort of a problem, whereas native leaders tend to be sort of slower to sort of adopt that idea. A lot of them do eventually, but
Interesting. Now, speaking about violence against Native Americans, we know that the Vikings had tried in Newfoundland in the 12th and 13th century, but had failed to properly colonize the land. What difference did post-Columbian expeditions, what were those factors which helped these post-Columbian expeditions succeed in winning wars sustainably against native tribes?
hmm. Well, here, watch me pretend as if I understand the Vikings. Um, so I'm just off the top of my head, I'm going to say one of the things, and I can't explain to you why, is post-Columbian European ventures are, I guess, a euphemism calling them ventures. Settler colonialism is massively aided by the unwitting introduction of European diseases, right? Smallpox, measles, flu, all these things just sort of cut a swath through native populations. And I don't know enough about the Vikings. For whatever reason, that doesn't seem to have sort of been an issue. I would imagine, again, um, the Vikings, of course, are coming over earlier. I would imagine part of it has to do just simply with technology and maybe not having enough colonists to make that work. I'd also, I originally was thinking about that question. It's of course, yes, they're clearly trying to colonize in parts of Canada, but generally speaking, Vikings, I would say, or in my limited understanding, more interested in sort of raiding and sort of snatching wealth and then going home rather than sort of true settler colonialism, right? I don't know, again, enough about, like, say, when they're in Newfoundland, which again is not maybe a great agricultural region. It'd be interesting if they had made it to, say, the Chesapeake, if they would have sort of adopted different strategies, right, where you could actually have a decent growing season and so forth. But um, yeah, I don't know. That to me, the Viking attempts are fascinating, but also I know so little about them.
Understood. Now, moving on to bad faith.
Hmm.
investigations, that is, murders committed by white settlers who pretended to be Native Americans. Case in point, the
Hmm.
Mountain Meadows massacres. Now, do we know of other incidents such as these where white settlers had murdered fellow white settlers in order to possibly instigate wars against seemingly inoffensive or uninvolved native tribes?
So I don't know if I have a specific incident, but the historian's consensus is uh, it's highly plausible. Again, there were, for example, by the 18th century, even officials at the time, like Agent Seagrove, for example, he was the U.S. agent of the Creeks, would write about somebody would find a party of people who'd been murdered and scalped on a road, and yet it seemed just the way it was perpetrated that these probably were actually whites who had murdered these people for robbery, homicide, and then tried to make it look like the Creeks or somebody else had done it. So I'm sure it did happen. I'm not sure. I don't think I have a specific case in my head that I can sort of tell you where this happened in sort of the context of the stuff I've looked at. But I mean, it almost certainly would have happened at some point, right? Because again, motive and opportunity on the frontier, it's so hard on the Trans-Appalachian frontier in the 18th and early 19th century just to enforce laws of any type. And so, and again, that the opportunity for crime, I think, tends to encourage crimes to be perpetrated. So, yeah, it would not surprise me at all, some of these, but I'm not sure I can give you a specific example.
Understood. Now, when did the idea of permanent Indian removal enter public discourse, and how did Andrew Jackson get elected on this basis, assuming this was his central plank for getting elected?
So, okay, so the first part, and a lot of people don't sort of know this. So when we think about Indian removal in the 1830s, that is not actually the first attempt to get people, particularly from the southeast, to move west of the Mississippi. The U.S. government had actually been kind of cajoling, in some cases, leaning on peoples. There were Cherokees who had immigrated west of the Mississippi even before the War of 1812. There are also, by the way, a number of tribes who voluntarily removed. For example, a good chunk of the Shawnees at the outbreak of the American Revolution said, "We don't want any part of this," and they moved into what's going to become Missouri. So there were multiple waves of Eastern Indians moving west of the Mississippi River even prior to Jacksonian removal. Now, Jackson was certainly a huge fan of removal for, I would certainly argue, rather crassly economic opportunism type reasons. Just sorry, the professor me. In terms of his actual election, Jackson, I mean, that was part of his platform, but the main two things I would say why Jackson wins election 1828 actually he was a really good example of sort of a cult of personality candidate in that basically every time he runs for office, especially after the War of 1812, he's running on a platform of "I'm Andrew Jackson and you love me because I killed all those Indians and those British guys that you didn't like," and which was true. He was very good at that, and so that was a big part of it. And then the 1828 election, a huge component of that was the fact that a lot of his supporters felt that he had been wrongfully he had wrongfully been denied the presidency in 1824 because, without going into the whole lecture, in the 1824 election, he actually had a plurality in the electoral college, but not the majority. And then John Quincy Adams was able to get enough of a coalition together to sort of win the election through the House of Representatives, but Jackson, and that was actually perfectly legitimate. But Jackson's supporters had this really emotional connection to him, and basically almost from they basically start campaigning for 1828 in 1825, and they had tremendous momentum. So Adams really didn't have a chance in 1808. But in terms of the Indian removal, again for Jackson, this has a lifelong sort of dislike and distrust of native peoples, despite the fact he actually had adopted a Red Stick Creek boy an orphan. Now, if you read the old campaign biographies, they'll talk, oh, Jackson, he was so magnanimous because he adopted this orphan. I would point out the kid was an orphan because of Jackson, but details. And what I find really fascinating, though, and sort of horrifying, if you look at Indian removal and sort of think about this sort of black mark on American honor, by the late 1820s, early 1830s, previous generations would have said, oh, well, the Cherokees and the Creeks and all these other Indians, we have to remove them for security purposes. But of course, they were clearly not a security risk. They had all signed treaties with the United States. They were all honoring those treaties, by the way. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were on lands the federal government had told them belonged to them. And the real sort of motivation for removal, particularly of those tribes in the Southeast, was they happened to be on land that was very obviously, very manifestly valuable for cotton revolution production. And so, and it's really interesting, kind of the mental jujitsu. Jacksonians go from saying, oh, well, we need to remove these dangerous Indians and take their land. Well, now we need to remove them because it would be better for them in the long run. They can't possibly survive next to us. Keep in mind, by the way, there was actually a guy by the last name of Van in the Cherokee Nation by this point who owned a number of African American slaves and cotton production lands. He was the wealthiest man in the Cherokee Nation. Some people argue he might have actually been the wealthiest man in the United States at that point. So clearly, living next to a bunch of white Georgians was not dangerous to his health. He was doing just fine, but that land was so valuable, races the excuse to sort of shuffle them off to the west. And again, kind of, at least from a couple centuries removed, the really irritating thing is at least the pretense that you're somehow doing people a favor by removing them from really, really valuable land that they want to hang on to and then sort of shoving them west of the Mississippi River. Not to mention, we might get to another question on those people already west of the Mississippi River. We're not looking for new immigrants at this point. They kind of had their own thing going. But yeah.
Weren't the Cherokee part of the five civilized nations tribe?
Yeah, and yes, when I do that lecture now, I always put that in quotes because that's a problematic phrase, calling them sort of civilized. But by standards of the 19th century, oh, absolutely. Again, sort of the leading Cherokees were very heavily assimilated. They wore Anglo-American style clothing. A lot of them, again, the wealthy ones had cotton plantations and enslaved people. The Cherokees had their own written language at this point. They had their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, which is just a real hoot to read if you're an historian. It's sort of fantastic. So they had their own constitution that was actually people they always it was based on the U.S. Constitution, which is true. Although there are certain things that were significantly different. For example, the U.S. Constitution was a deliberately, just getting off on a sidetrack here, a deliberately secular document, and that's the way James Madison wanted it. Whereas the Cherokee Constitution, as written, said that you could not be a full citizen of the Cherokees unless you believed in a future state of reward or punishment, basically heaven or hell. You could not, and the U.S. Constitution does not do that. But yeah, so again, they were, and that's really the thing. If you look at from the Washington administration on, there's this push, oh, these native peoples to survive, supposedly, they need to become sort of more like us. And the thing is, really in like a generation and a half, so many of them had. I mean, it's remarkable because you're really asking them to give up a tremendous amount. You're asking them to just ignore gender and economic roles that they had been using for millennia, probably at that point. And they did it in a shockingly short period of time, and we're doing just fine. But again, they're on really valuable, and of course for the Cherokees, probably the death knell is not only were they on this really valuable cotton growing land, but then somebody discovered gold on the Cherokee. And anytime historically, when someone discovers gold, people just lose their minds. And so that really kind of, and that's when Georgia really starts becoming aggressive about sort of, and it's interesting, right? Because if you look at Jackson, when it comes to the issue of seceding from the Union, his own birth state of South Carolina, he's not going to put up with that. He's not going to let them defy federal authority. But when Georgia wants to ignore the fact that the Constitution clearly says the federal government, and the Supreme Court said the same thing, not the states, has a monopoly on Indian affairs, Jackson just kind of sort of, turns his head to the side on that one because removing the Cherokees is beneficial to him. And so, uh, yeah, it's not the happiest period in American history.
I can imagine. You also mentioned Virginia becoming the laboratory for genocide.
Hmm.
Could you elaborate on this? Was this the first attempt, and was this then formulated into a cookie cutter model that other states then went ahead and applied?
Yeah, so that probably would look terrible on a bumper sticker next to Virginia's for lovers, I suppose, which is their preferred. So now, by the way, where people from the Old Dominion get mad at me, in fairness, part of this just has to do with chronology, right? They're the first sort of successful colony, so they are going to set precedents, right? And people are going to follow things that worked in Virginia. Other colonies are going to follow. So, for example, in the late 16 teens, the Virginia Company, originally it was a private venture, decides that to encourage colonists, they're going to institute what they call the headright system. And headrights basically said, hey, if you can pay your way over to Virginia, once you step off the boat, we will give you 50 acres of land just for showing up. Now, keep in mind, back in England at this time, literally half the people don't own any land whatsoever and have no chance of ever doing so. That's incredibly attractive, right? And so, and this is it's not a coincidence that basically almost every other colony is going to copy that comes after Virginia. Oh, headrights, that's a good way to, because you want colonists to come over. But of course, if you think about, well, when we say we're going to give you 50 acres of land, well, that land has to come from somebody. And that really sort of sets up uh, an intense competition with the local natives, the Powhatan Confederacy and others in Virginia, because every time those new colonists comes and you hand them another 50 acres, well, I mean, there's only so much good agricultural land in the eastern part of Virginia, and so that sets that off. Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think Virginians start to figure out fairly quickly, even before, well, certainly by the time tobacco agriculture becomes a big thing in the 16 teens, the sort of figures like, well, two groups want this agricultural land, and we mean to be the ones who are going to have it. And so, uh, you know, killing Indians is sort of a means to an end to expand their real estate empire, if you will, and their agricultural expertise or influence. And so, that becomes more and more important to them. And again, you're going to see other colonies, again, most colonies that come after them institute head rights. And it is kind of fascinating if you look at colonists, especially the ones who were sort of out on the frontier, seem to pretty quickly come to the notion, if they didn't have it already, that essentially the fewer Indians that there are, the fewer native peoples, the more land is available for us. And that seemed to be something, again, colony officials would sort of, argue with the tactic per se, but the ultimate goal of getting all that land for us, they're simpatico on that front, and they, are going to pursue, and again, for sort of, poor working class folks on the frontier, well, this is the most plausible option. Killing a bunch of people, driving them away, and then sort of taking their land, by conquest.
Understood. Now, speaking about tribes moving into territories
Hmm.
hitherto unpopulated or places that they as a tribe had never been to, like the Shawnee ending up in Missouri, did that lead to knock-on effects of competition between Shawnee and Arikara or other native tribes
Uh,
that we know of?
yeah, and again, this is one of in these sort of broad array of arguments that Eastern Indians had against being removed to the West, aside from the fact they just genuinely, for, by the way, religious reasons as much as anything else, did not want to move. They also understood that the peoples who were already there, yeah, they, again, you didn't have to explain to a Cherokee how having an alien people move in right next door could muck things up for you. And so they didn't want to be that. And in fact, you do see quite a bit in the early 19th century as more and more Indians from east of the Mississippi move west. They are actively competing for resources with the people who are already there. So the Rickaras, or a classic example I talk about in the book, the Osage Indians, who were this incredibly powerful group in sort of the Central Plains, just west of the Mississippi River around Missouri and Arkansas. They got to the point where um, they really got act like in sort of open warfare with Cherokees and Shawnees and others. And you get this weird situation, sort of counterintuitive, where by the 1820s or so, Osages were actually reasonably happy to have a white settler family move in because, well, they're gonna, cut down a few trees and they're gonna, farm 50 or 100 acres, but they're not gonna kill as many deer or bison or whatever as the Shawnees or the Cherokees or others. And again, that was a huge part of the Osage economy. And so they really sort of jealously guard that. And also, what's I found fascinating when I was doing the book, if you read about the reputation of the Osages, is like they're kind of like the Gambinos of the Central Plains. You don't mess with them, and yet the Cherokees and others actually held their own quite well, fighting against this group. And then eventually, of course, the United States government is going to sort of step into what they call the role of the Great Father and try to sort of mediate these disputes. Partly, again, there's always sort of a thread of the idea this is the humanitarian thing to do, but I think it's primarily, and this goes back to, Jefferson or even before, the idea when Indians are sort of engaged in open warfare against each other, white people can get caught in the crossfire, and we don't want that. So they would try and sort of make peace between these groups, not always successfully, not always to the joy of both groups, but they would. So yeah, no, there's a lot of nasty competition.
Understood. Now, the Civil War, the years leading up to the Civil War and perhaps a few years after were also tremendously tumultuous, not to mention violent.
Mm.
Now, how did this play out on the frontier?
So, I mean, on the Trans-Appalachian frontier, I'm not sure it's a huge factor, but of course, the Civil War goes west of the Mississippi, and you have what's going to become Oklahoma, for example, essentially became a war zone, a very nasty one. People going back and forth because this was at the time Indian country, and you had a lot of, paradoxically, you had a lot of these groups who had been in the, again, I'm using my air quotes, the five civilized tribes had been removed to what's going to become Oklahoma, and they had brought their African slaves with them. Well, when the war breaks out, first of all, they don't have any love for the federal government, fair enough. But oddly enough, they're going to strike up alliances with, in many cases, some of the same Southerners who had sort of led, called for their removal because they wanted to protect slavery as an institution. So there's a very sort of nasty sort of microcosm of the Civil War going on in Oklahoma between sort of pro-Union and pro-Confederacy natives. You also had individuals, for example, there was a Cherokee man, it actually the last surviving guy who'd signed the removal treaty, a guy named Stan Waddy, who ended up becoming the highest ranking Native American of the war. He was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army, and kind of like a genuinely scary guy. In the North, and you do have natives on both sides of the conflict. In the North, the guy who immediately popped into mind. There was a Seneca Indian from New York named Eli Parker, who was a staff officer for U.S. Grant and was present at Lee's surrender. So you've got that, but in terms of how it plays out on the frontier, especially in the Trans-Mississippi frontier, it's ugly. It's a lot of ugliness going on. And again, they're sort of, fighting for what they see as sort of their own kind of narrow self-interests. And a lot of sort of property losses and also sort of nasty things done to individuals takes place during the Civil War period.
Understood. And all of this is happening because the focus is on war, so they know that there are not going to be any judgments, there's not going to be any policing, no
Well,
one's going to ask any questions.
well, I mean, especially west of the Mississippi, and you have this also just between whites as well. Anytime you have a significant breakdown in law and order, it's almost an invitation to commit murders. And so, and yeah, that's also one of the features. Well, actually, not unlike the American Revolution in the Southeast. It's it's like you could use the cover of, oh, well, there's a war on to, oh, I never liked that guy anyway. I'm going to set his barn on fire. So there's a lot of that going on as well. And yeah, it does not, law and order really is sort of absent for long periods of time after this. But um, yeah, it's nasty.
Understood. Now, post Civil War, do you think that the Indian wars get industrialized from the white settler side? That now violence is executed at an industrial level and barbarity is no longer something that bothers people's conscience? That you will eradicate herds of bison so that we can starve them out. I mean, case in point, William Sherman's methods of bringing Atlanta to heel. We'll start them out. What might not have been done before.
So let's start with Sherman. And this might actually be a contribution of mine. So Sherman, of course, is famous for popularizing the concept of total war, right? And the idea, and his there's a logic to it, right? He's takes over for Grant in 1863. He says, "We're not just fighting the Confederate Army; we are fighting the Confederate people." And so therefore, civilians and civilian property are, as far as Sherman's concerned, a perfectly legitimate target. You know, that barn is full of hay. Confederate cavalry could eat that hay, or their horses, I guess. So let's burn it down. These rail lines, yeah, they might be taking food to the people of Atlanta, but they could also take food to the Confederate Army, so let's destroy them. And so in the American context, okay, he gets credit for that, but uh, something I talk about is the fact that, well, but if you're talking about the idea of civilians and food sources being legitimate targets, that probably goes back to like 1608, because again, with native peoples, uh, colonists and American armies after them found out pretty darn quickly that, tracking down native warriors out in the woods and defeating them, that's hard. These guys are good at that, and they're not just going to sort of play by your rules, but marching to a village, burning it down, and destroying the cornfield so that people starve to death. Well, that's actually fairly easy. Kidnapping women and children and using them as bargaining chips in negotiations, well, that's actually fairly easy and rather effective. It's incredibly sort of, and I find it fascinating. For a long time, historians, I don't know if we just, there's not a conspiracy, but just didn't think of this. But it's this idea that, wow, they've been doing that against Native people for a long time. Now, in terms of the influence of the war, I mean, military technology picks up pace. You have an entire generation of people who gain military experience. On the other hand, you also see this massive demobilization of the Army and Navy after the war. So I don't, and so I'm not sure if that plays into it so much as, but it is fascinating, right? If you look at essentially conquest of uh, Anglo-America, right? Well, you say, from the late 16th century up until probably the 1830s, right? You say Indian removal. Okay, well, that's well over 2 centuries. But then the conquest of the American West post Civil War takes like 3 decades. And I think a lot of that has to do, I'm not sure it's directly the influence of the Civil War so much as just technology and population. And it's hit sort of critical mass. And I think there's also sort of a sense, you could argue, maybe with white Americans after the Civil War. It's like, okay, we're increasingly tired of sort of playing around like we're not going to take all of North America. And so I think there's even less patience for sort of, Tecumseh Sherman is a really good example of this, or Phil Sheridan famously, horribly said the only Indian is a good Indian is a dead Indian. I think he was kind of given to hyperbole, but so this idea that after the Civil War, I suppose you could argue, well, that's probably where it plays in. This idea we are unified, modern, we're a big boy nation now. We're not interested in sort of being patient with indigenous peoples. This is our time, and we're going to sort of take this stuff. And they do sort of they really sort of ramp up the conquest. I suppose you could also that is one of the differences. Even though the army is so much smaller after the Civil War, the army becomes even more directly involved in settler colonialism post Civil War than it had been prior to. I think partly because there aren't that many white settlers in the West in the 1870s, 1880s.
Understood. What's that one remarkable war or episode that marks the final closure of the frontier and America becomes settled?
Typically, people look at the Wounded Knee massacre uh, in the early 1890s as sort of like the official end of the Indian Wars, although it's really calling that a battle would be incredibly generous, right? It's basically a horrible mistake that ends up being a tragic slaughter of a lot of people who are actually kind of in the act of surrendering. But so that's where it's usually seen. Although, again, and I try to point this out when I'm in class with students. Of course, genocide is a 20th century word, right? But if you look at the United Nations definition of genocide, it's not simply wiping people out. It's there are all kinds of sort of boxes that categories of genocide, whether it's what we might call sort of cultural genocide, right? Sort of and building to the depressing thing is the United States really checks a lot of those boxes with Native peoples, whether it's those Indian boarding schools, which are just absolutely horrific in sort of every possible way, to dispossessing people of their lands by hook and by crook. Um, and I think it's also important to remember that and genocide might be a loaded word, but certainly colonization and imperialism, in many ways, it continues. What time is it right now? I thought about this again in terms of like sort of just grabbing away people's lands. There was an effort, for example, during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, to help restore Native peoples to some of the lands that had been taken from them in the previous decades. But even today, this is still an issue, right? I was thinking about in Arizona, for example, there are massive deposits of copper, which have a lot of industrial, right? We have so many electronics, and it would be nice to have that, but it's actually on land that a number of Native peoples consider sacred, and they do not want. And it's kind of hard to argue with, yeah, I wouldn't want a huge mining interest going through, what I considered sacred lands either. Or another example, the Black Hills that are literally sacred to the Lakota peoples. The United States government has actually tried on several occasions to purchase that from and the Lakotas are not interested in a purchase. They actually want them back. So this process is it's not my area of expertise, the modern stuff, but it's a continuing process in many ways.
Understood. So my last question was on modern practices. How do how does the US government today play out these policies, given that so many eyes are watching? Now there's a better understanding of this un unjust violence which has been meted out to Native people, and there's so much more accountability which didn't exist earlier. So how does the US state now carry out its operations now in this time and age?
So it depends partly on the administration, quite frankly, and what is the current mood of the U.S. Congress, right? Which tends to change like a mood ring at times. Yeah, you're correct. No, I don't think it would be politically acceptable to, send the 82nd Airborne onto a reservation and start shooting people. That's a rather low bar that we've set. But in terms of just sort of general treatment of folks, again, there are a lot of Native peoples who are still fighting as hard as they can for official recognition. So they can deal with the federal government. For example, in the state of Indiana, there's a group that calls themselves the Miami of Tribe of Indiana. Now, the official Miami Nation is in Oklahoma, but there are a lot of folks in Indiana who are actually descended from the original Miamis on what had been private land grants, and they're still clamoring for recognition. Probably more egregious, the more recent one I was thinking of in this past year was the Miccosukis, who are a tribe. They were closely affiliated with the Seminoles, and actually were active participants in those wars in the 19th century. But they have a significant reservation. It's kind of west of Miami, Florida today. And in an instance, how often do you hear this today? The U.S. Congress, there was a bipartisan bill passed, massive majorities to grant them. There's a chunk of the Everglades. Like, why don't we just hand this back to the Miccosukis? They're going to take good care of it. They do have a track record for that. It's really not costing the U.S. government anything. It's not like there's oil on the land or something. So give it, and it was a done deal. And then the Miccosukis had the temerity to protest the creation of the alligator Alcatraz detention camp, and President Trump just sort of said, "Well, now you don't get that land." Which, so again, I'm not sure. Aside from hiring a bunch of lawyers, what the tactic is to combat stuff like that. But again, if anyone, I just did this recently. You drive through that territory. I mean, nature is lovely, but there's not a lot going on there. If you ever drive across that, take a sandwich would be my advice, because there's not a lot of place. Uh, I really can't see. It just seems really petty to not give that to the Miccosukis, because I'm sure they would love to have it and they would take very good care of it. That kind of stuff still echoes through today. So again, I I tell classes, students this. It's basically for Native right. I mean, it's gotten, don't worry, it's better. It's better than it was, but until the political calculus is you politicians, large numbers of politicians are going to suffer if they don't recognize Native sovereignty and rights. As long as it's not going to hurt them politically, it's really easy for them to just sort of sign off on that kind of silliness, because why not? It's Native American voting is still a huge problem there. Legally, they have the right to vote, and yet on a lot of reservations, particularly out west, it's shockingly difficult for people to actually be able to vote. So, um, yeah, it's what a depressing way to wrap up a talk about murder. That's
I agree. All I can say is Andrew Jackson still lives on.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, without drawing too many, if you look in the White House now, the Oval Office, there's a huge portrait of Andrew Jackson. I remember, and actually during the president's his first term in office, he was honoring. It was a nice thing. He was honoring some Navajo code talkers, and some genius photographer got a shot of this. So you've got the president and these Navajo war heroes, and in the background is the portrait of Andrew Jackson. Yeah, that's the symbolism is just sort of palpable, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, again, Jacksonianism and this idea, right? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. There are consistent themes. And again, some of your earlier questions, if I knew more about sort of conflicts in, say, Central Asia or something, I suspect, yeah, there are probably broad parallels to a lot of these things that aren't so lovely for us to consider.
I agree. I mean, as you said, that human tendency is broad and can be generalized. These traits, which were found in Native American tribes, could very well be found in Central Asian and West Asian tribes as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, if you, I remember during the Afghanistan conflict, right? And they would talk about, these sort of tribal peoples in Kashmir, and they're talking about sort of personal sense of honor, and also how I was like, yeah, a lot of this sounds familiar. I think I've heard this story before, and also watch your rear end if you go into their territory uninvited, because yeah, you need to follow. I would assume Richard White, the middle ground author, was watching. Like, yeah, there are certain protocols you need to follow, and if you don't, they don't like it. You are not. You may think you're in charge of this territory, but it's actually the people who live there are in charge, and mind your P's and Q's. Well,
Absolutely, absolutely. Robert, can we expect, hopefully, in the next couple of years, your 400-page revised addition to this book, or perhaps other books?
so Previn, I shouldn't admit this, but so when I had to hack a bunch of stuff out of this manuscript, I didn't delete it because I was like, no, this is good. So I am actually trying to put something together from a bit of a different angle. But yeah, I've got in the works, maybe 80% done. We'll see. Again, another idea of sort of the intersection of murder and diplomacy and how this plays out on the frontier. And then, quite frankly, I need to sort of stop talking about murders after a while, because it does. I say in the introduction, it's true. A lot of this book was researched and written during the COVID, and it was already you're not in a great mood, and then you're just talking about murder after murder after murder. It does, my joke has been the next project will be about happy puppies and kittens who lived long, love-filled lives. I'm not sure. Well, somebody would publish that, but that would be more fun to research, I think, than some of these horrible things. But yeah, I do have things you always have to if you're going to sort of actively be a scholar, you do need multiple things in the pipeline. And so I do actually have a couple things going now. So, hopefully, yeah, in the next 2, 3 years, I'll have something else hit the shelves.
You'll hear from me soon again then.
Oh, all right. That would be great.
Thanks, Robert, for this conversation. This was reading your book was deeply insightful, and I'm glad that you're holding up a candle to our past and showing us not just progress, but also some of our regrettable moments, these regresses, these lapses in human judgment. And it's important that they be cataloged. You are actually carrying out an act of social responsibility, reminding us of what we've done. Hopefully, future generations won't commit this kind of stupidity and blunder.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, well, there is a significant movement, right, that we should just try and ignore unpleasant things from the past that's being somehow divisive. But I really think that's how mistakes get repeated, right? And I'm a huge fan of the United States. But I also, when you love something, you do have to have a certain amount of honesty about it. And to me, that was something particularly as I was working on this project. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of ugly stuff there that sweeping it under the rug just really isn't an option.
There's a good reason why forensic science exists as a science, and coroners exist to do a job
Yeah,
as ugly as it might be, but they are holding up a light to know what has happened is not right here.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I agree.
Thanks again, Robert, for that. I know this is personally taking a toll on you, but thank you for your contributions.
Well, the good news is I have a couple parties to go to later today, so that'll be fun. Uh, if I can shake the murder out of my head, I can sort of wish people a happy retirement. But thank you so much for inviting me. I did enjoy this topic or not.
Thank you, Robert. This was talking to you was just as much fun, if not more than reading your book. We are making light of what was otherwise a grave and somber situation.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you again. Have a great day
You
and a
too.
great weekend. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye. Okay, clicking out.